Once again, in this phase of the dream, the patient is acknowledging his failure to experience to the full an important aspect of childhood and early adolescence. He missed out on the playfulness of the child and also on the rather more advanced pranks of the young teenager, and he is seeking ways in which those lost experiences and personal qualities can be rehabilitated. Next comes a curious change in the dream. The young man in black appears, and for a moment the dreamer feels that this is the true hero. That is all we are told about the man in black. Yet this fleeting glimpse introduces a theme of profound importance, a theme that occurs frequently in dreams. This is the concept of the shadow, which plays such a vital role in analytical psychology. Dr. Jung has pointed out that the shadow cast by the conscious mind of the individual contains the hidden, repressed, and unfavorable or nefarious aspects of the personality. But this darkness is not just the simple converse of the conscious ego. Just as the ego contains unfavorable and destructive attitudes, so the shadow has good qualities, normal instincts and creative impulses. Ego and shadow, indeed, although separate, are inextricably linked together in much the same way that thought and feeling are related to each other. The ego, nevertheless, is in conflict with the shadow, in what Dr. Jung once called the battle for deliverance. In the struggle of primitive man to achieve consciousness, this conflict is expressed by the contest between the archetypal hero and the cosmic powers of evil, personified by dragons and other monsters. In the developing consciousness of the individual, the hero figure is the symbolic means by which the emerging ego overcomes the inertia of the unconscious mind and liberates the mature man from a regressive longing to return to the blissful state of infancy in a world dominated by his mother. Usually in mythology, the hero wins his battle against the monster. I shall say more about this in a moment. But there are other hero myths in which the hero gives in to the monster. A familiar type is that of Jonah and the whale, in which the hero is swallowed by a sea monster that carries him on a night sea journey from west to east, thus symbolizing the supposed transit of the sun from sunset to dawn. The hero goes into darkness, which represents a kind of death. I have encountered this theme in dreams presented in my own clinical experience. The battle between the hero and the dragon is the more active form of this myth, and it shows more clearly the archetypal theme of the ego's triumph over regressive trends. For most people, the dark or negative side of the personality remains unconscious. The hero, on the contrary, must realize that the shadow exists and that he can draw strength from it. He must come to terms with its destructive powers if he is to become sufficiently terrible to overcome the dragon. That is, before the ego can triumph, it must master and assimilate the shadow. One can see this theme, incidentally, in a well-known literary hero figure, Goethe's character of Faust. In accepting the wager of Mephistopheles, Faust put himself in the power of a shadow figure that Goethe describes as part of that power which, willing evil, finds the good. Like the man whose dream I have been discussing, Faust had failed to live out to the full an important part of his early life. He was, accordingly, an unreal or incomplete person who lost himself in a fruitless quest for metaphysical goals that failed to materialize. He was still unwilling to accept life's challenge to live both the good and the bad. It is to this aspect of the unconscious that the young man in black in my patient's dream seems to refer. Such a reminder of the shadow side of his personality, of its powerful potential, and its role in preparing the hero for the struggles of life, is an essential transition from the earlier parts of the dream to the theme of the sacrificial hero, the handsome young man who places himself on an altar. This figure represents the form of heroism that is commonly associated to the ego-building process of late adolescence. A man expresses the ideal principles of his life at this time, sensing their power both to transform himself and to change his relations with others. He is, so to speak, in the bloom of youth, attractive, full of energy and idealism. Why, then, does he willingly offer himself as a human sacrifice? The reason, presumably, is the same as that which made the twins of the Winnebago myth give up their power on pain of destruction. The idealism of youth, which drives one so hard, is bound to lead to overconfidence. The human ego can be exalted to experience godlike attributes, but only at the cost of overreaching itself and falling to disaster. This is the meaning of the story of Icarus, the youth who is carried up to heaven on his fragile, humanly contrived wings, but who flies too close to the sun and plunges to his doom. All the same, the youthful ego must always run this risk, for if a young man does not strive for a higher goal than he can safely reach, he cannot surmount the obstacles between adolescence and maturity. So far, I have been talking about the conclusions that at the level of his personal associations, my patient could draw from his own dream. Yet there is an archetypal level of the dream, the mystery of the proffered human sacrifice. It is precisely because it is a mystery, that it is expressed in a ritual act that in its symbolism carries us a long way back into man's history. Here, as the man lies stretched out on an altar, we see a reference to an act even more primitive than those performed on the altar stone in the temple at Stonehenge. There, as on so many primitive altars, we can imagine a yearly solstice rite combined with the death and rebirth of a mythological hero. The ritual has a sorrow about it that is also a kind of joy, an inward acknowledgement that death also leads to a new life. Whether it is expressed in the prose epic of the Winnebago Indians, in a lament for the death of Balder in the Norse Eddas, in Walt Whitman's poems of mourning for Abraham Lincoln, or in the dream ritual whereby a man returns to his youthful hopes and fears, it is the same theme, the drama of new birth through death. The end of the dream brings out a curious epilogue in which the dreamer at last becomes involved in the action of the dream. He and others are on a platform from which they have to descend. He does not trust the ladder because of the possible interference of hoodlums, but a woman encourages him to believe he can go down safely, and this is accomplished. Since I found out from his associations that the whole performance he witnessed was part of his analysis, a process of inner change that he was experiencing, he was presumably thinking of the difficulty of getting back to everyday reality again. His fear of the toughs, as he calls them, suggests his fear that the trickster archetype may appear in a collective form. The saving elements in the dream are the man-made ladder, which here is probably a symbol of the rational mind, and the presence of the woman who encourages the dreamer to use it. Her appearance in the final sequence of the dream points to a psychic need to include a feminine principle as a complement to all this excessively masculine activity. It should not be assumed from what I have said, or from the fact that I have chosen to use the Winnebago myth to illuminate this particular dream, that one must seek for complete and wholly mechanical parallels between a dream and the materials one can find in the history of mythology. Each dream is individual to the dreamer, and the precise form it takes is determined by his own situation. What I have sought to show is the manner in which the unconscious draws on this archetypal material and modifies its patterns to the dreamer's needs. Thus, in this particular dream, one must not look for a direct reference to what the Winnebago describe in the red horn or twin cycles. The reference is rather to the essence of those two themes, to the sacrificial element in them. As a general rule, it can be said that the need for hero symbols arises when the ego needs strengthening, when, that is to say, the conscious mind needs assistance in some task that it cannot accomplish unaided or without drawing on the sources of strength that lie in the unconscious mind. In the dream I have been discussing, for instance, there was no reference to one of the more important aspects of the myth of the typical hero, his capacity to save or protect beautiful women from terrible danger. The damsel in distress was a favorite myth of medieval Europe. This is one way in which myths or dreams refer to the anima, the feminine element of the male psyche that Goethe called the eternal feminine. The nature and function of this female element will be discussed later in this book by Dr. von Franz, but its relation to the hero figure can be illustrated here by a dream produced by another patient, also a man of mature years. He began by saying, "I had returned from a long hike through India. A woman had equipped myself and a friend for the journey, and on my return I reproached her for failing to give us black rain hats, telling her that through this oversight we had been soaked by the rain." This introduction to the dream, it later emerged, referred to a period in this man's youth when he was given to taking heroic walks through dangerous mountain country in company with a college friend. As he had never been to India, and in view of his own associations to this dream, I concluded that the dream journey signified his exploration of a new region, not, that is to say, a real place, but the realm of the unconscious. In his dream, the patient seems to feel that a woman, presumably a personification of his anima, has failed to prepare him properly for this expedition. The lack of a suitable rain hat suggests that he feels in an unprotected state of mind in which he is uncomfortably affected by exposure to new and not altogether pleasant experiences. He believes that the woman should have provided a rain hat for him, just as his mother provided clothes for him to wear as a boy. This episode is reminiscent of his early picaresque wanderings when he was sustained by the assumption that his mother, the original feminine image, would protect him against all dangers. As he grew older, he saw that this was a childish illusion, and he now blames his misfortune on his own anima, not his mother. In the next stage of the dream, the patient speaks of participating in a hike with a group of people. He grows tired and returns to an outdoor restaurant, where he finds his raincoat, together with the rain hat that he had missed earlier. He sits down to rest, and as he does so, he notices a poster stating that a local high school boy is taking the part of Perseus in a play. Then the boy in question appears, who turns out to be not a boy at all, but a husky young man. He is dressed in gray with a black hat, and he sits down to talk with another young man dressed in a black suit. Immediately after this scene, the dreamer feels a new vigor and finds that he is capable of rejoining his party. They all then climb over the next hill. There, below them, he sees their destination. It is a lovely harbor town. He feels both heartened and rejuvenated by the discovery. Here, in contrast to the restless, uncomfortable, and lonely journey of the first episode, the dreamer is with a group. The contrast marks a change from an earlier pattern of isolation and youthful protest to the socializing influence of a relation to others. Since this implies a new capacity for relatedness, it suggests that his anima must now be functioning better than it was before, symbolized by his discovery of the missing hat that the anima figure had previously failed to provide for him. But the dreamer is tired, and the scene at the restaurant reflects his need to look at his earlier attitudes in a new light with the hope of renewing his strength by this regression. And so it turns out. What he first sees is a poster suggesting the enactment of a youthful hero role, a high school boy playing the part of Perseus. Then he sees the boy, now a man, with a friend who makes a sharp contrast to him. The one dressed in light gray, the other in black, can be recognized from what I have previously said as a version of the twins. They are hero figures expressing the opposites of ego and alter ego, which, however, appear here in a harmonious and unified relation. The patient's associations confirmed this and emphasized that the figure in gray represents a well-adapted worldly attitude to life, whereas the figure in black represents the spiritual life, in the sense that a clergyman wears black. That they wore hats, and he now had found his own, points to their having achieved a relatively mature identity of a kind that he had felt to be severely lacking in his own earlier adolescent years, when the quality of tricksterism still clung to him, in spite of his idealistic self-image as a seeker of wisdom. His association to the Greek hero Perseus was a curious one, which proved especially significant because it revealed a glaring inaccuracy. It turned out that he thought Perseus was the hero who slew the Minotaur and rescued Ariadne from the Cretan labyrinth. As he wrote the name down for me, he discovered his mistake, that it was Theseus, not Perseus, who slew the Minotaur. And this mistake became suddenly meaningful, as such slips often do, by making him notice what these two heroes had in common. They both had to overcome their fear of unconscious demonic maternal powers and had to liberate from these powers a single youthful feminine figure. Perseus had to cut off the head of the Gorgon Medusa, whose horrifying visage and snaky locks turned all who gazed upon them to stone. He later had to overcome the dragon that guarded Andromeda. Theseus represented the young patriarchal spirit of Athens, who had to brave the terrors of the Cretan labyrinth with its monstrous inmate the Minotaur, which perhaps symbolized the unhealthy decadence of matriarchal Crete. In all cultures, the labyrinth has the meaning of an entangling and confusing representation of the world of matriarchal consciousness. It can be traversed only by those who are ready for a special initiation into the mysterious world of the collective unconscious. Having overcome this danger, Theseus rescued Ariadne, a maiden in distress. This rescue symbolizes the liberation of the anima figure from the devouring aspect of the mother image. Not until this is accomplished can a man achieve his first true capacity for relatedness to women. The fact that this man had failed adequately to separate the anima from the mother was emphasized in another dream, in which he encountered a dragon, a symbolic image for the devouring aspect of his attachment to his mother. This dragon pursued him, and because he had no weapon, he began to get the worst of the struggle. Significantly, however, his wife appeared in the dream, and her appearance somehow made the dragon smaller and less threatening. This change in the dream showed that in his marriage, the dreamer was belatedly overcoming the attachment to his mother. In other words, he had to find a means of freeing the psychic energy attached to the mother-son relationship in order to achieve a more adult relation to women, and indeed to adult society as a whole. The hero-dragon battle was the symbolic expression of this process of growing up. But the hero's task has an aim that goes beyond biological and marital adjustment. It is to liberate the anima as that inner component of the psyche that is necessary for any true creative achievement. In this man's case, we have to guess the probability of this outcome because it is not directly stated in the dream of the Indian journey. But I am sure he would confirm my hypothesis that his journey over the hill and the sight of his goal as a peaceful harbor town contained the rich promise that he would discover his authentic anima function. He would thus be cured of his early resentment at not being given protection, the rain hat, by the woman for his journey through India. In dreams, significantly placed towns can often be anima symbols. The man had won this promise of security for himself by his contact with the authentic hero archetype and had found a new cooperative and related attitude to the group. His sense of rejuvenation naturally followed. He had drawn on the inner source of strength that the hero archetype represents. He had clarified and developed that part of him which was symbolized by the woman, and he had, by his ego's heroic act, liberated himself from his mother. These and many other examples of the hero myth in modern dreams show that the ego as hero is always essentially a bearer of culture rather than a purely egocentric exhibitionist. Even Trickster, in his misguided or unpurposive way, is a contributor to the cosmos as primitive man sees it. In Navajo mythology, as Coyote, he hurled the stars into the sky as an act of creation. He invented the necessary contingency of death, and in the myth of emergence, he helped lead the people through the hollow reed, whereby they escaped from one world to another above it, where they were safe from the threat of flood. We have here a reference to that form of creative evolution which evidently begins on a childlike, preconscious or animal level of existence. The ego's rise to effective conscious action becomes plain in the true culture hero. In the same fashion, the childish or adolescent ego frees itself from the oppression of parental expectations and becomes individual. As part of this rise to consciousness, the hero-dragon battle may have to be fought and refought to liberate energy for the multitude of human tasks that can form a culture pattern out of chaos. When this is successful, we see the full hero image emerging as a kind of ego strength, or, if we are speaking in collective terms, a tribal identity that has no further need to overcome the monsters and the giants. It has reached the point where these deep forces can be personalized. The feminine element no longer appears in dreams as a dragon, but as a woman. Similarly, the shadow side of the personality takes on a less menacing form. This important point is illustrated in the dream of a man nearing 50. All his life he had suffered from periodic attacks of anxiety associated with fear of failure, originally engendered by a doubting mother. Yet his actual achievements, both in his profession and in his personal relations, were well above average. In his dream, his 9-year-old son appeared as a young man of about 18 or 19, dressed in the shining armor of a medieval knight. The young man is called upon to fight a host of men in black, which he prepares at first to do. Then he suddenly removes his helmet and smiles at the leader of the menacing host. It is clear that they will not engage in the battle, but will become friends. The son in the dream is the man's own youthful ego, which had frequently felt threatened by the shadow in the form of self-doubt. He had, in a sense, waged a successful crusade against this adversary all his mature life. Now, partly through the actual encouragement of seeing his son grow up without such doubts, but mainly by forming a suitable image of the hero in the form closest to his own environmental pattern, he finds it no longer necessary to fight the shadow. He can accept it. That is what is symbolized in the act of friendship. He is no longer driven to a competitive struggle for individual supremacy, but is assimilated to the cultural task of forming a democratic sort of community. Such a conclusion, reached in the fullness of life, goes beyond the heroic task and leads one to a truly mature attitude. This change, however, does not take place automatically. It requires a period of transition, which is expressed in the various forms of the archetype of initiation. The archetype of initiation. In a psychological sense, the hero image is not to be regarded as identical with the ego proper. It is better described as the symbolic means by which the ego separates itself from the archetypes evoked by the parental images in early childhood. Dr. Jung has suggested that each human being has originally a feeling of wholeness, a powerful and complete sense of the self, and from the self, the totality of the psyche, the individualized ego consciousness emerges as the individual grows up. Within the past few years, the works of certain followers of Jung have begun to document the series of events by which the individual ego emerges during the transition from infancy through childhood. This separation can never become final without severe injury to the original sense of wholeness, and the ego must continually return to reestablish its relation to the self in order to maintain a condition of psychic health. It would appear from my studies that the hero myth is the first stage in the differentiation of the psyche. I have suggested that it seems to go through a fourfold cycle by which the ego seeks to achieve its relative autonomy from the original condition of wholeness. Unless some degree of autonomy is achieved, the individual is unable to relate himself to his adult environment. But the hero myth does not ensure that this liberation will occur. It only shows how it is possible for it to occur, so that the ego may achieve consciousness. There remains the problem of maintaining and developing that consciousness in a meaningful way so that the individual can live a useful life and can achieve the necessary sense of self-distinction in society. Ancient history and the rituals of contemporary primitive societies have provided us with a wealth of material about myths and rites of initiation whereby young men and women are weaned away from their parents and forcibly made members of their clan or tribe. But in making this break with the childhood world, the original parent archetype will be injured, and the damage must be made good by a healing process of assimilation into the life of the group. The identity of the group and the individual is often symbolized by a totem animal. Thus, the group fulfills the claims of the injured archetype and becomes a kind of second parent to which the young are first symbolically sacrificed, only to re-emerge into a new life. In this drastic ceremony, which looks very like a sacrifice to the powers that might hold the young man back, as Dr. Jung has put it, we see how the power of the original archetype can never be permanently overcome in the manner envisaged by the hero-dragon battle, without a crippling sense of alienation from the fruitful powers of the unconscious. We saw in the myth of the twins how their hubris, expressing excessive ego self-separation, was corrected by their own fear of the consequences, which forced them back into a harmonious ego-self relation. In tribal societies, it is the initiation rite that most effectively solves this problem. The ritual takes the novice back to the deepest level of original mother-child identity or ego-self-identity, thus forcing him to experience a symbolic death. In other words, his identity is temporarily dismembered or dissolved in the collective unconscious. From this state, he is then ceremonially rescued by the rite of the new birth. This is the first act of true consolidation of the ego with the larger group, expressed as totem, clan, or tribe, or all three combined. The ritual, whether it is found in tribal groups or in more complex societies, invariably insists upon this rite of death and rebirth, which provides the novice with a rite of passage from one stage of life to the next, whether it is from early childhood to later childhood, or from early to late adolescence, and from then to maturity. Initiatory events are not, of course, confined to the psychology of youth. Every new phase of development throughout an individual's life is accompanied by a repetition of the original conflict between the claims of the self and the claims of the ego. In fact, this conflict may be expressed more powerfully at the period of transition from early maturity to middle age, between 35 and 40 in our society, than at any other time in life. And the transition from middle age to old age creates again the need for affirmation of the difference between the ego and the total psyche. The hero receives his last call to action in defense of ego consciousness against the approaching dissolution of life in death. At these crucial periods, the archetype of initiation is strongly activated to provide a meaningful transition that offers something more spiritually satisfying than the adolescent rites with their strong secular flavor. The archetypal patterns of initiation in this religious sense, known since ancient times as the mysteries, are woven into the texture of all ecclesiastical rituals requiring a special manner of worship at the time of birth, marriage, or death. As in our study of the hero myth, so in the study of initiation, we must look for examples in the subjective experiences of modern people, and especially of those who have undergone analysis. It is not surprising that there should appear in the unconscious of someone who is seeking help from a doctor specializing in psychic disorders images that duplicate the major patterns of initiation as we know them from history. Perhaps the commonest of these themes to be found in young people is the ordeal, or trial of strength. This might seem to be identical with what we have already noticed in modern dreams illustrating the hero myth, such as the sailor who had to submit to the weather and to beatings, or that proof of fitness represented in the hike through India of the man without a rain hat. We can also see this theme of physical suffering carried to its logical end in the first dream I discussed, when the handsome young man became a human sacrifice on an altar. This sacrifice resembled the approach to initiation, but its end was obscured. It seemed to round off the hero cycle, to make way for a new theme. There is one striking difference between the hero myth and the initiation rite. The typical hero figures exhaust their efforts in achieving the goal of their ambitions. In short, they become successful even if immediately afterward they are punished or killed for their hubris. In contrast to this, the novice for initiation is called upon to give up willful ambition and all desire and to submit to the ordeal. He must be willing to experience this trial without hope of success. In fact, he must be prepared to die. And though the token of his ordeal may be mild, a period of fasting, the knocking out of a tooth or tattooing, or agonizing, the infliction of the wounds of circumcision, subincision, or other mutilations, the purpose remains always the same, to create the symbolic mood of death from which may spring the symbolic mood of rebirth. A young man of 25 dreams of climbing a mountain, on top of which there is a kind of altar. Near the altar, he sees a sarcophagus with a statue of himself upon it. Then a veiled priest approaches, carrying a staff on which there glows a living sun disk. Discussing the dream later, the young man said that climbing a mountain reminded him of the effort he was making in his analysis to achieve self-mastery. To his surprise, he finds himself, as it were, dead, and instead of a sense of achievement, he feels deprivation and fear. Then comes a feeling of strength and rejuvenation as he is bathed in the warm rays of the sun disk. This dream shows quite succinctly the distinction we must make between initiation and the hero myth. The act of climbing the mountain seems to suggest a trial of strength. It is the will to achieve ego consciousness in the heroic phase of adolescent development. The patient had evidently thought that his approach to therapy would be like his approach to other tests of manhood, which he had approached in the competitive manner characteristic of young men in our society. But the scene by the altar corrected this mistaken assumption, showing him that his task is rather to submit to a power greater than himself. He must see himself as if he were dead and entombed in a symbolic form, the sarcophagus, that recalls the archetypal mother as the original container of all life. Only by such an act of submission can he experience rebirth. An invigorating ritual brings him to life again, as the symbolic son of a son-father. Here again, we might confuse this with a hero cycle, that of the twins, the children of the sun. But in this case, we have no indication that the initiate will overreach himself. Instead, he has learned the lesson in humility by experiencing a rite of death and rebirth that marks his passage from youth to maturity. According to his chronological age, he should already have made this transition, but a prolonged period of arrested development has held him back. This delay had plunged him into a neurosis for which he had come for treatment, and the dream offers him the same wise counsel that he could have been given by any good tribal medicine man, that he should give up scaling mountains to prove his strength and submit to the meaningful ritual of an initiatory change that could fit him for the new moral responsibilities of manhood. The theme of submission as an essential attitude toward promotion of the successful initiation rite can be clearly seen in the case of girls or women. Their rite of passage initially emphasizes their essential passivity, and this is reinforced by the psychological limitation on their autonomy imposed by the menstrual cycle. It has been suggested that the menstrual cycle may actually be the major part of initiation from a woman's point of view, since it has the power to awaken the deepest sense of obedience to life's creative power over her. Thus she willingly gives herself to her womanly function, much as a man gives himself to his assigned role in the community life of his group. On the other hand, the woman, no less than the man, has her initial trials of strength that lead to a final sacrifice for the sake of experiencing the new birth. This sacrifice enables a woman to free herself from the entanglement of personal relations and fits her for a more conscious role as an individual in her own right. In contrast, a man's sacrifice is a surrender of his sacred independence. He becomes more consciously related to woman. Here we come to that aspect of initiation which acquaints man with woman and woman with man in such a way as to correct some sort of original male-female opposition. Man's knowledge, logos, then encounters woman's relatedness, eros, and their union is represented as that symbolic ritual of a sacred marriage which has been at the heart of initiation since its origins in the mystery religions of antiquity. But this is exceedingly difficult for modern people to grasp, and it frequently takes a special crisis in their lives to make them understand it. Several patients have told me dreams in which the motif of sacrifice is combined with the motif of the sacred marriage. One of these was produced by a young man who had fallen in love but was unwilling to marry for fear that marriage would become a kind of prison presided over by a powerful mother figure. His own mother had been a strong influence in his childhood, and his future mother-in-law presented a similar threat. Would not his wife-to-be dominate him in the same way these mothers had dominated their children? In his dream, he was engaged in a ritual dance, along with another man and two other women, one of whom was his fiancée. The others were an older man and wife, who impressed the dreamer because, despite their closeness to each other, they seemed to have room for their individual differences and did not appear to be possessive. These two therefore represented to this young man a married state that did not impose undue constraint on the development of the individual nature of the two partners. If it were possible for him to achieve this condition, marriage would then become acceptable to him. In the ritual dance, each man faced his woman partner, and all four took their places at the corners of a square dancing ground. As they danced, it became apparent that this was also a kind of sword dance. Each dancer had in his hand a short sword with which to perform a difficult arabesque, moving arms and legs in a series of movements that suggested alternate impulses of aggression and submission to each other. In the final scene of the dance, all four dancers had to plunge the swords into their own breasts and die. Only the dreamer refused to accomplish the final suicide and was left standing alone after the others had fallen. He felt deeply ashamed of his cowardly failure to sacrifice himself with the others. This dream brought home to my patient the fact that he was more than ready to change his attitude to life. He had been self-centered, seeking the illusory safety of personal independence, but inwardly dominated by the fears caused by childhood subjection to his mother. He needed a challenge to his manhood in order to see that unless he sacrificed his childish state of mind, he would be left isolated and ashamed. The dream, and his subsequent insight into its meaning, dispelled his doubts. He had passed through the symbolic rite by which a young man gives up his exclusive autonomy and accepts his shared life in a related, not just heroic, form. And so he married and found appropriate fulfillment in his relationship with his wife. Far from impairing his effectiveness in the world, his marriage actually enhanced it. Quite apart from the neurotic fear that invisible mothers or fathers may be lurking behind the marriage veil, even the normal young man has good reason to feel apprehensive about the wedding ritual. It is essentially a woman's initiation rite in which a man is bound to feel like anything but a conquering hero. No wonder we find in tribal societies such counterphobic rituals as the abduction or rape of the bride. It enables the man to cling to the remnants of his heroic role at the very moment that he must submit to his bride and assume the responsibilities of marriage. But the theme of marriage is an image of such universality that it also has a deeper meaning. It is an acceptable, even necessary, symbolic discovery of the feminine component of a man's own psyche, just as much as it is the acquisition of a real wife. So one may encounter this archetype in a man of any age in response to a suitable stimulus. Not all women, however, react trustingly to the married state. A woman patient who had unfulfilled longings for a career, which she had had to give up for a very difficult and short-lived marriage, dreamed that she was kneeling opposite a man who was also kneeling. He had a ring that he prepared to put on her finger, but she stretched out her right-hand ring finger in a tense manner, evidently resisting this ritual of marital union. It was easy to point out her significant error. Instead of offering the left-hand ring finger, by which she could accept a balanced and natural relation to the masculine principle, she had wrongly assumed that she had to put her entire conscious, that is, right-sided identity in the service of the man. In fact, marriage required her to share with him only that subliminal, natural, that is, left-handed part of herself, in which the principle of union would have a symbolic, not a literal or absolute meaning. Her fear was the fear of the woman who dreads to lose her identity in a strongly patriarchal marriage, which this woman had good reason to resist. Nevertheless, the sacred marriage, as an archetypal form, has a particularly important meaning for the psychology of women, and one for which they are prepared during their adolescence by many preliminary events of an initiatory character. Beauty and the Beast. Girls in our society share in the masculine hero myths because, like boys, they must also develop a reliable ego identity and acquire an education. But there is an older layer of the mind that seems to come to the surface in their feelings, with the aim of making them into women, not into imitation men. When this ancient content of the psyche begins to make its appearance, the modern young woman may repress it because it threatens to cut her off from the emancipated equality of friendship and opportunity to compete with men that have become her modern privileges. This repression may be so successful that for a time she will maintain an identification with the masculine intellectual goals she learned at school or college. Even when she marries, she will preserve some illusion of freedom despite her ostensible act of submission to the archetype of marriage, with its implicit injunction to become a mother. And so there may occur, as we very frequently see today, that conflict which in the end forces the woman to rediscover her buried womanhood in a painful but ultimately rewarding manner. I saw an example of this in a young married woman who did not yet have any children, but who intended to have one or two eventually, because it would be expected of her. Meanwhile, her sexual response was unsatisfactory. This worried her and her husband, though they were unable to offer any explanation for it. She had graduated with honors from a good women's college and enjoyed a life of intellectual companionship with her husband and other men. Although this side of her life went well enough much of the time, she had occasional outbursts of temper and talked in an aggressive fashion that alienated men and gave her an intolerable feeling of dissatisfaction with herself. She had a dream at this time that seemed so important she sought professional advice to understand it. She dreamed she was in a line of young women like herself, and as she looked ahead to where they were going, she saw that as each came to the head of the line, she was decapitated by a guillotine. Without any fear, the dreamer remained in the line, presumably quite willing to submit to the same treatment when her turn came. I explained to her that this meant she was ready to give up the habit of living in her head. She must learn to free her body to discover its natural sexual response and the fulfillment of its biological role in motherhood. The dream expressed this as the need to make a drastic change. She had to sacrifice the masculine hero role. As one might expect, this educated woman had no difficulty in accepting this interpretation at an intellectual level, and she set about trying to change herself into a more submissive kind of woman. She did then improve her love life and became the mother of 2 very satisfactory children. As she grew to know herself better, she began to see that for a man, or the masculine-trained mind in women, life is something that has to be taken by storm as an act of the heroic will. But for a woman to feel right about herself, life is best realized by a process of awakening. A universal myth expressing this kind of awakening is found in the fairy tale of Beauty and the Beast. The best-known version of this story relates how Beauty, the youngest of 4 daughters, becomes her father's favorite because of her unselfish goodness. When she asks her father only for a white rose instead of the more costly presents demanded by the others, she is aware only of her inner sincerity of feeling. She does not know that she is about to endanger her father's life and her ideal relation with him, for he steals the white rose from the enchanted garden of Beast, who is stirred to anger by the theft, and requires him to return in 3 months for his punishment, presumably death. In allowing the father this reprieve to go home with his gift, Beast behaves out of character, especially when he also offers to send him a trunk full of gold when he gets home. As Beauty's father comments, the Beast seems cruel and kind at the same time. Beauty insists upon taking her father's punishment and returns after 3 months to the enchanted castle. There she is given a beautiful room where she has no worries and nothing to fear except the occasional visits of Beast, who repeatedly comes to ask her if she will someday marry him. She always refuses. Then, seeing in a magic mirror a picture of her father lying ill, she begs Beast to allow her to return to comfort him, promising to return in a week. Beast tells her that he will die if she deserts him, but she may go for a week. At home, her radiant presence brings joy to her father and envy to her sisters, who plot to detain her longer than her promised stay. At length, she dreams that Beast is dying of despair, so, realizing she has overstayed her time, she returns to resuscitate him. Quite forgetting the dying Beast's ugliness, Beauty ministers to him. He tells her that he was unable to live without her, and that he will die happy now that she is returned. But Beauty realizes that she cannot live without Beast, that she has fallen in love with him. She tells him so and promises to be his wife if only he will not die. At this, the castle is filled with a blaze of light and the sound of music, and Beast disappears. In his place stands a handsome prince, who tells Beauty that he had been enchanted by a witch and turned into the Beast. The spell was ordained to last until a beautiful girl should love Beast for his goodness alone. In this story, if we unravel the symbolism, we are likely to see that Beauty is any young girl or woman who has entered into an emotional bond with her father, no less binding because of its spiritual nature. Her goodness is symbolized by her request for a white rose, but in a significant twist of meaning, her unconscious intention puts her father and then herself in the power of a principle that expresses not goodness alone, but cruelty and kindness combined. It is as if she wished to be rescued from a love holding her to an exclusively virtuous and unreal attitude. By learning to love Beast, she awakens to the power of human love concealed in its animal and therefore imperfect, but genuinely erotic form. Presumably, this represents an awakening of her true function of relatedness, enabling her to accept the erotic component of her original wish, which had to be repressed because of a fear of incest. To leave her father, she had, as it were, to accept the incest fear, to allow herself to live in its presence in fantasy until she could get to know the animal man and discover her own true response to it as a woman. In this way, she redeems herself and her image of the masculine from the forces of repression, bringing to consciousness her capacity to trust her love as something that combines spirit and nature in the best sense of the words. A dream of an emancipated woman patient of mine represented this need to remove the incest fear, a very real fear in this patient's thoughts, because of her father's over-close attachment to her following his wife's death. The dream showed her being chased by a furious bull. She fled at first, but realized it was no use. She fell, and the bull was upon her. She knew her only hope was to sing to the bull, and when she did, though in a quavering voice, the bull calmed down and began licking her hand with its tongue. The interpretation showed that she could now learn to relate to men in a more confidently feminine way, not only sexually, but erotically in the wider sense of relatedness on the level of her conscious identity. But in the cases of older women, the beast theme may not indicate the need to find the answer to a personal fixation or to release a sexual inhibition or any of the things that the psychoanalytically minded rationalist may see in the myth. It can be, in fact, the expression of a certain kind of woman's initiation, which may be just as meaningful at the onset of the menopause as at the height of adolescence, and it may appear at any age when the union of spirit and nature has been disturbed. A woman of menopausal age reported the following dream. I am with several anonymous women whom I don't seem to know. We go downstairs in a strange house and are confronted suddenly by some grotesque ape-men with evil faces, dressed in fur, with gray and black rings, with tails, horrible and leering. We are completely in their power, but suddenly I feel the only way we can save ourselves is not to panic and run or fight, but to treat these creatures with humanity, as if to make them aware of their better side. So one of the ape-men comes up to me, and I greet him like a dancing partner and begin to dance with him. Later, I have been given supernatural healing powers, and there is a man who is at death's door. I have a kind of quill, or perhaps a bird's beak, through which I blow air into his nostrils, and he begins to breathe again. During the years of her marriage and the raising of her children, this woman had been obliged to neglect her creative gift, with which she had once made a small but genuine reputation as a writer. At the time of her dream, she had been trying to force herself back to work again, at the same time criticizing herself unmercifully for not being a better wife, friend, and mother. The dream showed her problem in the light of other women who might be going through a similar transition, descending, as the dream puts it, into the lower regions of a strange house from a too highly conscious level. This we can guess to be the entrance to some meaningful aspect of the collective unconscious, with its challenge to accept the masculine principle as animal man, that same heroic, clown-like trickster figure we met at the beginning of the primitive hero cycles. For her to relate to this ape-man and humanize him by bringing out what is good in him meant that she would first have to accept some unpredictable element of her natural creative spirit. With this, she could cut across the conventional bonds of her life and learn to write in a new way, more appropriate for her in the second part of life. That this impulse is related to the creative masculine principle is shown in the second scene, where she resuscitates a man by blowing air through a kind of bird's beak into his nose. This pneumatic procedure suggests the need for a revival of the spirit, rather than the principle of erotic warmth. It is a symbolism known all over the world. The ritual act brings the creative breath of life to any new achievement. The dream of another woman emphasizes the nature aspect of Beauty and the Beast. Something flies or is thrown in through the window, like a large insect with whirling spiral legs, yellow and black. It then becomes a queer animal, striped yellow and black like a tiger, with bear-like, almost human paws and a pointed wolf-like face. It may run loose and harm children. It is Sunday afternoon, and I see a little girl all dressed in white on her way to Sunday school. I must get the police to help. But then I see the creature has become part woman, part animal. It fawns upon me, wants to be loved. I feel it's a fairy tale situation or a dream, and only kindness can transform it. I try to embrace it warmly, but I can't go through with it. I push it away. But I have the feeling I must keep it near and get used to it, and maybe someday I'll be able to kiss it. Here we have a different situation from the previous one. This woman had been too intensively carried away by the masculine creative function within herself, which had become a compulsive, mental, that is, airborne preoccupation. Thus, she has been prevented from discharging her feminine, wifely function in a natural way. In association to this dream, she said, "When my husband comes home, my creative side goes underground, and I become the over-organized housewife." Her dream takes this unexpected turn of transforming her spirit gone bad into the woman she must accept and cultivate in herself. In this way, she can harmonize her creative intellectual interests with the instincts that enable her to relate warmly to others. This involves a new acceptance of the dual principle of life in nature, of that which is cruel but kind, or, as we might say in her case, ruthlessly adventurous, but at the same time humbly and creatively domestic. These opposites obviously cannot be reconciled except on a highly sophisticated psychological level of awareness, and would of course be harmful to that innocent child in her Sunday school dress. The interpretation one could place on this woman's dream is that she needed to overcome some excessively naive image of herself. She had to be willing to embrace the full polarity of her feelings, just as Beauty had to give up the innocence of trusting in a father who could not give her the pure white rose of his feeling without awakening the beneficent fury of the beast. Orpheus and the Son of Man. Beauty and the Beast is a fairy tale with the quality of a wildflower, appearing so unexpectedly and creating in us such a natural sense of wonder that we do not notice for the moment that it belongs to a definite class, genus, and species of plant. The kind of mystery inherent in such a story is given a universal application not only in a larger historical myth, but also in the rituals whereby the myth is expressed or from which it may be derived. The type of ritual and myth appropriately expressing this type of psychological experience is exemplified in the Greco-Roman religion of Dionysus, and in its successor, the religion of Orpheus. Both of these religions provided a significant initiation of the type known as mysteries. They brought forth symbols associated with a god-man of androgynous character who was supposed to have an intimate understanding of the animal or plant world and to be the master of initiation into their secrets. The Dionysiac religion contained orgiastic rites that implied the need for an initiate to abandon himself to his animal nature and thereby experience the full fertilizing power of the Earth Mother. The initiating agent for this rite of passage in the Dionysiac ritual was wine. It was supposed to produce the symbolic lowering of consciousness necessary to introduce the novice into the closely guarded secrets of nature, whose essence was expressed by a symbol of erotic fulfillment. The god Dionysus joined with Ariadne, his consort, in a sacred marriage ceremony. In time, the rites of Dionysus lost their emotive religious power. There emerged an almost oriental longing for liberation from their exclusive preoccupation with the purely natural symbols of life and love. The Dionysiac religion, shifting constantly from spiritual to physical and back again, perhaps proved too wild and turbulent for some more ascetic souls. These came to experience their religious ecstasies inwardly, in the worship of Orpheus. Orpheus was probably a real man, a singer, prophet, and teacher who was martyred and whose tomb became a shrine. No wonder the early Christian church saw in Orpheus the prototype of Christ. Both religions brought to the late Hellenistic world the promise of a future divine life. Because they were men, yet also mediators of the divine, for the multitudes of the dying Grecian culture in the days of the Roman Empire, they held the longed-for hope of a future life. There was, however, one important difference between the religion of Orpheus and the religion of Christ. Though sublimated into a mystical form, the Orphic mysteries kept alive the old Dionysiac religion. The spiritual impetus came from a demigod in whom was preserved the most significant quality of a religion rooted in the art of agriculture. That quality was the old pattern of the fertility gods, who came only for the season, in other words, the eternally recurrent cycle of birth, growth, fullness, and decay. Christianity, on the other hand, dispelled the mysteries. Christ was the product and reformer of a patriarchal, nomadic, pastoral religion whose prophets represented their Messiah as a being of absolutely divine origin. The Son of Man, though born of a human virgin, had his beginning in heaven, whence he came in an act of God's incarnation in man. After his death he returned to heaven, but returned once and for all, to reign on the right hand of God until the second coming, when the dead shall arise. Of course, the asceticism of early Christianity did not last. The memory of the cyclic mysteries haunted its followers to the extent that the Church eventually had to incorporate many practices from the pagan past into its rituals. The most meaningful of these may be found in the old records of what was done on Holy Saturday and Easter Sunday in celebration of the resurrection of Christ, the baptismal service that the medieval Church made into a suitable and deeply meaningful initiation rite. But that ritual has scarcely survived into modern times, and it is completely absent in Protestantism. The ritual that has survived much better, and that still contains the meaning of a central initiation mystery for the devout, is the Catholic practice of the elevation of the chalice. It has been described by Dr. Jung in his Transformation Symbolism in the Mass. The lifting up of the chalice in the air prepares the spiritualization of the wine. This is confirmed by the invocation to the Holy Ghost that immediately follows. The invocation serves to infuse the wine with Holy Spirit, for it is the Holy Ghost who begets, fulfills, and transforms. After the elevation, the chalice was, in former times, set down to the right of the host, to correspond with the blood that flowed from the right side of Christ. The ritual of communion is everywhere the same, whether it is expressed by drinking of the cup of Dionysus or of the holy Christian chalice. But the level of awareness each brings to the individual participant is different. The Dionysiac participant looks back to the origin of things, to the storm birth of the God who is blasted from the resistant womb of Mother Earth. In the frescoes of the Villa dei Misteri in Pompeii, the enacted rite evoked the god as a mask of terror, reflected in the cup of Dionysus offered by the priest to the initiate. Later, we find the winnowing basket, with its precious fruits of the earth, and the phallus as creative symbols of the god's manifestation as the principle of breeding and growth. In contrast to this backward look, with its central focus on nature's eternal cycle of birth and death, the Christian mystery points forward to the initiate's ultimate hope of union with a transcendent God. Mother Nature, with all her beautiful seasonal changes, has been left behind, and the central figure of Christianity offers spiritual certainty, for he is the Son of God in heaven. Yet the two somehow fuse in the figure of Orpheus, the god who remembers Dionysus but looks forward to Christ. The psychological sense of this intermediate figure has been described by the Swiss author Linda Fierz-David in her interpretation of the Orphic rite pictured in the Villa dei Misteri. Orpheus taught while he sang and played the lyre, and his singing was so powerful that it mastered all nature. When he sang to his lyre, the birds flew about him, the fish left the water and sprang to him, the wind and the sea became still, the rivers flowed upward toward him. It did not snow, and there was no hail. Trees and the very stones followed after Orpheus. Tiger and lion lay down near him next to the sheep, and the wolves next to the stag and the roe. Now, what does this mean? It surely means that through a divine insight into the meaning of natural events, nature's happenings become harmoniously ordered from within. Everything becomes light, and all creatures appeased when the mediator, in the act of worshipping, represents the light of nature. Orpheus is an embodiment of devotion and piety. He symbolizes the religious attitude that solves all conflicts, since thereby the whole soul is turned toward that which lies on the other side of all conflict. And as he does this, he is truly Orpheus, that is, a good shepherd, his primitive embodiment. Both as good shepherd and as mediator, Orpheus strikes the balance between the Dionysiac religion and the Christian religion, since we find both Dionysus and Christ in similar roles, though, as I have said, differently oriented as to time and direction in space, one a cyclic religion of the netherworld, the other heavenly and eschatological or final. This series of initiatory events, drawn from the context of religious history, is repeated endlessly and with practically every conceivable individual twist of meaning in the dreams and fantasies of modern people. In a state of heavy fatigue and depression, a woman undergoing analysis had this fantasy. I sit on the side of a long, narrow table in a high vaulted room with no window. My body is hunched over and shrunken. There is nothing over me but a long white linen cloth that hangs from my shoulders to the floor. Something crucial has happened to me. There is not much life left in me. Red crosses on gold discs appear before my eyes. I recall that I have made some sort of commitment a long time ago, and wherever I am now must be part of this. I sit there a long time. Now I slowly open my eyes, and I see a man who sits beside me, who is to heal me. He appears natural and kind, and he is talking to me, though I don't hear him. He seems to know all about where I have been. I am aware that I am very ugly, and that there must be an odor of death around me. I wonder if he will be repelled. I look at him for a very long time. He does not turn away. I breathe more easily. Then I feel a cool breeze or cool water pour over my body. I wrap the white linen cloth across me now and prepare for a natural sleep. The man's healing hands are on my shoulders. I recall vaguely that there was a time when there were wounds there, but the pressure of his hand seems to give me strength and healing. This woman had previously felt threatened by doubts about her original religious affiliation. She had been brought up as a devout Catholic of the old school, but since her youth she had struggled to free herself from the formal religious conventions followed by her family. Yet the symbolic events of the church year and the richness of her insight into their meaning remained with her throughout the process of her psychological change. And in her analysis, I found this working knowledge of religious symbolism most helpful. The significant elements she singled out of her fantasy were the white cloth, which she understood as a sacrificial cloth, the vaulted room, which she considered to be a tomb, and her commitment, which she associated with the experience of submission. This commitment, as she called it, suggested a ritual of initiation with a perilous descent into the vault of death, which symbolized the way she had left church and family to experience God in her own fashion. She had undergone an imitation of Christ in the true symbolic sense, and like him she had suffered the wounds that preceded this death. The sacrificial cloth suggests the winding sheet or shroud in which the crucified Christ was wrapped and then placed in the tomb. The end of the fantasy introduces the healing figure of a man, loosely associated with me as her analyst, but appearing also in his natural role as a friend, fully aware of her experience. He speaks to her in words she cannot yet hear, but his hands are reassuring and give a sense of healing. One senses in this figure the touch and the word of the Good Shepherd, Orpheus or Christ, as mediator, and also, of course, as healer. He is on the side of life, and has to convince her that she may now come back from the vault of death. Shall we call this rebirth or resurrection? Both, perhaps, or neither. The essential rite proclaims itself at the end. The cool breeze or water flowing over her body is the primordial act of purification or cleansing of the sin of death, the essence of true baptism. The same woman had another fantasy in which she felt that her birthday fell upon the day of Christ's resurrection. This was much more meaningful for her than the memory of her mother, who had never given her the feeling of reassurance and renewal she so much wished for on her childhood birthdays. But this did not mean she identified herself with the figure of Christ. For all his power and glory, something was lacking, and as she tried to reach him through prayer, he and his cross were lifted up to heaven out of her human reach. In this second fantasy, she fell back upon the symbol of rebirth as a rising sun, and a new feminine symbol began to make its appearance. First of all, it appeared as an embryo in a watery sack. Then she was carrying an 8-year-old boy through the water, passing a danger point. Then a new movement occurred in which she no longer felt threatened or under the influence of death. She was in a forest by a little spring waterfall. Green vines grow all around. In my hands I have a stone bowl in which there is spring water, some green moss, and violets. I bathe myself under the waterfall. It is golden and silky, and I feel like a child. The sense of these events is clear, though it is possible to miss the inner meaning in the cryptic description of so many changing images. Here we have, it seems, a process of rebirth, in which a larger spiritual self is reborn and baptized in nature as a child. Meanwhile, she has rescued an older child who was in some way her own ego at the most traumatic period of her childhood. She then carried it through water past the danger point, thus indicating her fear of a paralyzing sense of guilt if she should depart too far from her family's conventional religion. But religious symbolism is significant by its absence. All is in the hands of nature. We are clearly in the realm of the shepherd Orpheus, rather than the risen Christ. A dream followed this sequence, which brought her to a church resembling the church in Assisi with Giotto's frescoes of St. Francis. She felt more at home here than she would in other churches, because St. Francis, like Orpheus, was a religious man of nature. This revived her feelings about the change in her religious affiliation that had been so painful to undergo, but now she believed she could joyfully face the experience, inspired by the light of nature. The series of dreams ended with a distant echo of the religion of Dionysus. One could say that this was a reminder that even Orpheus can at times be a little too far removed from the fecundating power of the animal god in man. She dreamed that she was leading a fair-haired child by the hand. We are happily participating in a festival that includes the sun and the forests and flowers all around. The child has a little white flower in her hand, and she places it on the head of a black bull. The bull is part of the festival and is covered with festive decorations. This reference recalls the ancient rites that celebrated Dionysus in the guise of a bull. But the dream did not end there. The woman added, "Sometime later, the bull is pierced by a golden arrow." Now, besides Dionysus, there is another pre-Christian rite in which the bull plays a symbolic role. The Persian sun god Mithras sacrifices a bull. He, like Orpheus, represents the longing for a life of the spirit that might triumph over the primitive animal passions of man, and, after a ceremony of initiation, give him peace. This series of images confirms a suggestion that is found in many fantasy or dream sequences of this type, that there is no final peace, no resting point. In their religious quest, men and women, especially those who live in modern Western Christianized societies, are still in the power of those early traditions that strive within them for supremacy. It is a conflict of pagan or Christian beliefs, or, one might say, of rebirth or resurrection. End of Side 4. Change side selector switch. This book is continued on the next cassette. Side 5. Man and His Symbols by Carl G. Jung. Continuing with Ancient Myths and Modern Man on page 148. A more direct clue to the solution of this dilemma is to be found in this woman's first fantasy in a curious piece of symbolism that could easily be overlooked. The woman says that in her death vault she saw before her eyes a vision of red crosses on gold discs. As became clear later in her analysis, she was about to experience a profound psychic change and to emerge out of this death into a new kind of life. We might imagine, therefore, that this image, which came to her in the depth of her despair of life, should in some way herald her future religious attitude. In her subsequent work, she did in fact produce evidence for thinking that the red crosses represented her devotion to the Christian attitude, while the gold discs represented her devotion to the pre-Christian mystery religions. Her vision had told her that she must reconcile these Christian and pagan elements in the new life that lay ahead. One last but important observation concerns the ancient initiation rites and their relation to Christianity. The initiation rite celebrated in the Eleusinian mysteries, the rites of worship of the fertility goddesses Demeter and Persephone, was not considered appropriate merely for those who sought to live life more abundantly. It was also used as a preparation for death, as if death also required an initiatory rite of passage of the same kind. On a funeral urn found in a Roman grave near the Columbarium on the Esquiline Hill, we find a clear bas-relief representing scenes of the final stage of initiation, where the novice is admitted to the presence and converse of the goddesses. The rest of the design is devoted to two preliminary ceremonies of purification, the sacrifice of the mystic pig and a mysticized version of the sacred marriage. This all points to an initiation into death, but in a form that lacks the finality of mourning. It hints at that element of the later mysteries, especially of Orphism, which makes death carry a promise of immortality. Christianity went even further. It promised something more than immortality, which in the old sense of the cyclic mysteries might merely mean reincarnation, for it offered the faithful an everlasting life in heaven. So we see again, in modern life, the tendency to repeat old patterns. Those who have to learn to face death may have to relearn the old message that tells us that death is a mystery for which we must prepare ourselves in the same spirit of submission and humility as we once learned to prepare ourselves for life. Symbols of transcendence. The symbols that influence man vary in their purpose. Some men need to be aroused and experience their initiation in the violence of a Dionysiac thunder rite. Others need to be subdued, and they are brought to submission in the ordered design of temple precinct or sacred cave, suggestive of the Apollonian religion of later Greece. A full initiation embraces both themes, as we can see when we look either at the material drawn from ancient texts or at living subjects. But it is quite certain that the fundamental goal of initiation lies in taming the original trickster-like wildness of the juvenile nature. It therefore has a civilizing or spiritualizing purpose, in spite of the violence of the rites that are required to set this process in motion. There is, however, another kind of symbolism, belonging to the earliest known sacred traditions, that is also connected with the periods of transition in a person's life. But these symbols do not seek to integrate the initiate with any religious doctrine or secular group consciousness. On the contrary, they point to man's need for liberation from any state of being that is too immature, too fixed, or final. In other words, they concern man's release from, or transcendence of, any confining pattern of existence as he moves toward a superior or more mature stage in his development. A child, as I have said, possesses a sense of completeness, but only before the initial emergence of his ego consciousness. In the case of an adult, a sense of completeness is achieved through a union of the consciousness with the unconscious contents of the mind. Out of this union arises what Jung called the transcendent function of the psyche, by which a man can achieve his highest goal, the full realization of the potential of his individual self. Thus, what we call symbols of transcendence are the symbols that represent man's striving to attain this goal. They provide the means by which the contents of the unconscious can enter the conscious mind, and they also are themselves an active expression of those contents. These symbols are manifold in form. Whether we encounter them in history or in the dreams of contemporary men and women who are at a critical stage in their lives, we can see their importance. At the most archaic level of this symbolism, we again meet the trickster theme. But this time, he no longer appears as a lawless would-be hero. He has become the shaman, the medicine man, whose magical practices and flights of intuition stamp him as a primitive master of initiation. His power resides in his supposed ability to leave his body and fly about the universe as a bird. In this case, the bird is the most fitting symbol of transcendence. It represents the peculiar nature of intuition working through a medium, that is, an individual who is capable of obtaining knowledge of distant events or facts of which he consciously knows nothing by going into a trance-like state. Evidence of such powers can be found as far back as the Paleolithic period of prehistory, as the American scholar Joseph Campbell has pointed out in commenting upon one of the famous cave paintings recently discovered in France. At Lascaux, he writes, there is a shaman depicted lying in a trance, wearing a bird mask, with a figure of a bird perched on a staff beside him. The shamans of Siberia wear such bird costumes to this day, and many are believed to have been conceived by their mothers from the descent of a bird. The shaman, then, is not only a familiar denizen, but even the favored scion of those realms of power that are invisible to our normal waking consciousness, which all may visit briefly in a vision, but through which he roams, a master. At the highest level of this type of initiatory activity, far from those tricks of the trade by which magic so frequently replaces true spiritual insight, we find the Hindu master yogis. In their trance states, they go far beyond the normal categories of thought. One of the commonest dream symbols for this type of release through transcendence is the theme of the lonely journey or pilgrimage, which somehow seems to be a spiritual pilgrimage, on which the initiate becomes acquainted with the nature of death. But this is not death as a last judgment or other initiatory trial of strength. It is a journey of release, renunciation, and atonement, presided over and fostered by some spirit of compassion. This spirit is more often represented by a mistress rather than a master of initiation, a supreme feminine, that is, anima figure, such as Kuan Yin in Chinese Buddhism, Sophia in the Christian Gnostic doctrine, or the ancient Greek goddess of wisdom, Pallas Athena. Not only the flight of birds or the journey into the wilderness represents this symbolism, but any strong movement exemplifying release. In the first part of life, when one is still attached to the original family and social group, this may be experienced as that moment of initiation at which one must learn to take the decisive steps into life alone. It is the moment that T.S. Eliot describes in The Wasteland, when one faces the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. At a later period of life, one may not need to break all ties with the symbols of meaningful containment, but nonetheless one can be filled with that spirit of divine discontent which forces all free men to face some new discovery or to live their lives in a new way. This change may become especially important in the period between middle age and old age, which is the time in life when so many people are considering what to do in their retirement, whether to work or to play, whether to stay at home or to travel. If their lives have been adventurous, insecure, or full of change, they may long for a settled life and the consolations of religious certainty. But if they have lived chiefly within the social pattern in which they were born, they may desperately need a liberating change. This need may be filled temporarily by a trip around the world, or by nothing more than a move to a smaller house. But none of these external changes will serve unless there has been some inner transcendence of old values in creating, not just inventing, a new pattern of life. A case of this latter sort is a woman who had lived in a style of life that she, her family, and friends had long enjoyed because it was so well-rooted, culturally nourishing, and secure from transitory fashions. She had this dream. I found some strange pieces of wood, not carved, but with natural, beautiful shapes. Someone said, Neanderthal man brought them. Then I saw at a distance these Neanderthal men, looking like a dark mass, but I could not see one of them distinctly. I thought I would take back from this place a piece of their wood. Then I went on, as if on a journey by myself, and I looked down into an enormous abyss, like an extinct volcano. There was water in part of it, and there I expected to see more Neanderthal men, but instead I saw black water pigs that had come out of the water and were running in and out of the black volcanic rocks. In contrast to this woman's family attachments and her highly cultivated style of life, the dream takes her to a prehistoric period more primitive than anything we can visualize. She can find no social group among these ancient men. She sees them as an embodiment of a truly unconscious, collective dark mass in the distance. Yet they are alive, and she may carry away a piece of their wood. The dream emphasizes that the wood is natural, not carved. Therefore, it comes from a primordial, not a culturally conditioned level of the unconscious. The piece of wood, remarkable for its great age, links this woman's contemporary experience to the distant origins of human life. We know from many examples that an ancient tree or plant represents symbolically the growth and development of psychic life, as distinct from instinctual life, commonly symbolized by animals. Hence, in this piece of wood, this woman acquired a symbol of her link with the deepest layers of the collective unconscious. Next, she speaks of continuing her journey alone. This theme, as I have already pointed out, symbolizes the need for release as an initiatory experience. So here we have another symbol of transcendence. Then, in the dream, she sees a huge crater of an extinct volcano, which has been the channel for a violent eruption of fire from the deepest layers of the earth. We can surmise that this refers to a significant memory trace, which leads back to a traumatic experience. This she associated to a personal experience early in her life when she had felt the destructive yet creative force of her passions to such an extent that she feared she would go out of her mind. She had found in late adolescence a quite unexpected need to break away from her family's excessively conventional social pattern. She had achieved this break without serious distress and had been able to return eventually to make her peace with the family. But there lingered a profound wish to make a still greater differentiation from her family background and to find freedom from her own pattern of existence. This dream recalls another. It came from a young man who had a totally different problem, but who seemed to need a similar type of insight. He, too, had the urge to achieve differentiation. He dreamed of a volcano, and from its crater he saw two birds taking flight, as if in fear that the volcano was about to erupt. This was in a strange, lonely place with a body of water between him and the volcano. In this case, the dream represented an individual initiation journey. It is similar to cases reported among the simple food-gathering tribes, which are the least family-conscious groups we know. In these societies, the young initiate must take a lonely journey to a sacred place. In Indian cultures of the North Pacific coast, it may actually be a crater lake, where, in a visionary or trance-like state, he encounters his guardian spirit in the form of an animal, a bird, or natural object. He closely identifies himself with this bush soul and thereby becomes a man. Without such an experience, he is regarded, as an Achumawi medicine man put it, as an ordinary Indian, nobody. The young man's dream came at the beginning of his life, and it pointed to his future independence and identity as a man. The woman I have described was approaching the end of her life, and she experienced a similar journey and seemed to need to acquire a similar independence. She could live out the remainder of her days in harmony with an eternal human law that by its antiquity transcended the known symbols of culture. But such independence does not end in a state of yogi-like detachment that would mean a renunciation of the world with all its impurities. In the otherwise dead and blasted landscape of her dream, the woman saw signs of animal life. These are water pigs, unknown to her as a species. They therefore would carry the meaning of a special type of animal, one that can live in two environments, in water or on the earth. This is the universal quality of the animal as a symbol of transcendence. These creatures, figuratively coming from the depths of the ancient Earth Mother, are symbolic denizens of the collective unconscious. They bring into the field of consciousness a special thonic, underworld message that is somewhat different from the spiritual aspirations symbolized by the birds in the young man's dream. Other transcendent symbols of the depths are rodents, lizards, snakes, and sometimes fish. These are intermediate creatures that combine underwater activity and the bird flight with an intermediate terrestrial life. The wild duck or the swan are cases in point. Perhaps the commonest dream symbol of transcendence is the snake, as represented by the therapeutic symbol of the Roman god of medicine, Aesculapius, which has survived to modern times as a sign of the medical profession. This was originally a non-poisonous tree snake. As we see it, coiled around the staff of the healing god, it seems to embody a kind of mediation between earth and heaven. A still more important and widespread symbol of chthonic transcendence is the motif of the two entwined serpents. These are the famous Naga serpents of ancient India, and we also find them in Greece as the entwined serpents on the end of the staff belonging to the god Hermes. An early Grecian herm is a stone pillar with a bust of the god above. On one side are the entwined serpents, and on the other an erect phallus. As the serpents are represented in the act of sexual union, and the erect phallus is unequivocally sexual, we can draw certain conclusions about the function of the herm as a symbol of fertility. But we are mistaken if we think this only refers to biological fertility. Hermes is trickster in a different role as a messenger, a god of the crossroads, and finally the leader of souls to and from the underworld. His phallus, therefore, penetrates from the known into the unknown world, seeking a spiritual message of deliverance and healing. Originally, in Egypt, Hermes was known as the ibis-headed god Thoth, and therefore was conceived as the bird form of the transcendent principle. Again, in the Olympian period of Greek mythology, Hermes recovered attributes of the bird life to add to his chthonic nature as serpent. His staff acquired wings above the serpents, becoming the caduceus, or winged staff of Mercury, and the god himself became the flying man, with his winged hat and sandals. Here we see his full power of transcendence, whereby the lower transcendence from underworld snake consciousness, passing through the medium of earthly reality, finally attains transcendence to superhuman or